welcome to a brand new year and a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tushar Shetty. Well, it's 2025 and it's also the 2-year anniversary of Beyond the Indus. In fact, it was on the 1st of January 2023 that Joe and I had our first official meeting at a rooftop bar in Soho House, Mumbai. And it's been an incredible journey since then. We've interviewed politicians, industrialists, human rights watchers, and some of the best South Asia academics, journalists, and policy experts around the world. And I'm deeply grateful to both the diplomat family who've made this journey possible, as well as you, our listeners, for coming with us all the way. But this is honestly a very much a collaborative effort. And if you have any ideas on how we can grow and engage the community of South Asia watchers, by setting up collaborations and joint projects, or even have suggestions for stories that you think we may have missed out on, you can write to us at beyondtheindus@gmail.com. That's all one word, beyondtheindus@gmail.com, and send us your ideas and suggestions. But that's enough of the chit chat. Let's move on to our story of the month. After the jirga was over, two of the Afghan tribal elders came over and we chatted for a while over a pot of green tea. Last month, said one, some American officers called us to a hotel in Jalalabad for a meeting. One of them asked me, "Why do you hate us?" I replied, "Because you blow down our doors, enter our houses, pull our women by the hair, and kick our children. We cannot accept this. We will fight back, and we will break your teeth, and when your teeth are broken, you will leave, just as the British left before you. It's just a matter of time. These are the last days of the Americans," said the other elder. "Next, it will be China." So this paragraph concludes one of William Dalrymple's most riveting books on Afghan history, Return of the King. What struck me about that anecdote was that the Afghan elder he was chatting with specifically predicted that China would be the next great colonizer after the British, the Soviets, and the Americans that they would have to kick out of their country. And this prediction seems to be coming true, but not in Afghanistan specifically. Our story this month takes us to the western frontiers of the subcontinent, to the Pakistani provinces of Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. In 2021, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, key figures in the Pakistan establishment celebrated it as the unshackling of the chains of slavery. They were in for a bit of a disappointment. The Taliban and its proxies across the border fueled a campaign of militancy and instability at a time when Pakistan was going through a difficult political and economic situation, the so-called Nazuk mode for Pakistan watchers. What is surprising, though, is that the recent attacks have actually targeted projects that are linked to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC. The CPEC is not just a lifeline for Pakistan's economy. It's also one of the most important components of China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative. So why are groups in Balochistan and KPK coordinating attacks on Chinese engineers and projects, risking the wrath of both Beijing and Islamabad? We'll be speaking to two guests today to help us unpack this story. Uzair Younus will speak to the economics of the CPEC, and Kunwar Khuldune Shahid will help us break down the politics and geopolitics behind the rise of militancy and its impact on CPEC in Pakistan's Wild West. Stay tuned. So joining us today is Uzair Younus. Uzair is a Washington, D.C. based economist who is currently a principal at the Asia Group, where he advises global companies on developing business strategies that align with public good needs across South Asia. Previously, he's also served as the director of the Pakistan Initiative at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Uzair regularly publishes articles on South Asian politics and economic issues for The Prophet magazine and Dawn newspaper, and has been featured on various news outlets, including Bloomberg, CNN, and CNBC. Uzair also has an excellent podcast called Pakistonomy, which focuses on the issues, challenges, and opportunities in the Pakistan economy. So I'm glad to have him on to help break down the trajectory, the challenges, and the outlook for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So Uzair, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So, is there China and Pakistan have always had strong relations, the so-called Iron Brotherhood. But the inception of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, seemed to have marked a new phase for economic cooperation between the Iron Brothers. Could you start by just giving our listeners an overview of CPEC? How it got started, what were the sort of projects and components planned under its ambit, and what were the motivating factors driving its inception for both Pakistan as well as China?
Sure, and as you said, this relationship goes back decades, and has been rooted in infrastructure as well. If you look at the mighty Karakoram Highway that connected northern Pakistan and its mountains down south to the heartland of the country, that project sort of is Exhibit A of that relationship and the role infrastructure has played in that relationship. CPEC began as an idea in the tail end of the People's Party government when Asif Ali Zardari was president of the country, who is currently also president. And an MOU was signed at that point in time between China and Pakistan. It went to the next level when Nawaz Sharif became prime minister following the 2013-2014 general elections and signed up Pakistan Economic Corridor as a formal economic corridor under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative began at that point in time. Now, it's important to place the creation of this project or this corridor in context of what was going on both globally and in Pakistan at that point in time. You had the world economy coming out of the global financial crisis. China had excess capacity at that point in time for its infrastructure companies, as well as a whole host of other companies that were looking to export their excess capacity. There was a global reach for yield. For interest rates being down at such a low level. So, emerging markets like Pakistan were able to take advantage of this environment. And then within the Pakistani context, Pakistan was still in play, both between the United States and the Chinese. You had the famous Kerry Lugar Berman bill from the Obama era that was still being rolled out in Pakistan. The war in Afghanistan was continuing, so Pakistan was a key partner, albeit a frustrating partner for the United States at that point in time in Afghanistan. And so there was this competition playing out between both the United States and China. And within Pakistan's own political economy, terrorism was at really, really high peak. This was the era when, for example, in Karachi, paramilitary forces had to be called in to end the gang war and associated conflict and kidnapping and extortion from the Taliban and a whole host of other militant actors as well. And Pakistani cities, forget about small towns and villages, were experiencing 16 to 18-hour power outages, rolling blackouts on a near daily basis, along with suicide bombings and terrorist activity as well. So this was a chaotic time within Pakistan, and what Pakistan wanted from not just China but from the broader international community and its key partners was support in helping deal with both the terrorism challenge as well as the economic challenge. And that's where China stepped up in the form of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. These were a bunch of infrastructure projects, key among them being a bunch of investments in power plants to help end or bring an end to the Pakistani power sector crisis. So, a number of flagship power sector power plants were set up by Chinese investors through government support. And then you had a significant amount of investments go into highways and roadways all across the country. Two main routes were sort of called out in the plans itself. One was the eastern route, sort of going north into Punjab and through into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And then there was the western route, which would connect parts of Balochistan with the rest of the country as well. So, all in all, that was the project. Now, a lot of people say 60 billion, 37 billion, 50 billion dollar was the total amount. The numbers are sort of hard to put together, and you have to count in different ways to reach different conclusions. But all in all, it was the biggest infrastructure project or economic project in Pakistan in recent memory.
Right. And as you've mentioned, the world has changed a lot since its inception in 2015. We've seen a lot of political and economic turmoil in Pakistan. In your view, how has the scope and the ambitions of CPEC evolved since that time? How would you evaluate the progress of CPEC so far compared to the original envisioned goals? Would you say that there's some projects and areas that have been implemented more successfully than others?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at sort of the blueprint or the stated set of projects in CPEC, you have the so-called early harvest projects. These include primarily power plants and highway projects. And then, of course, the famed Lahore Orange Line was added to CPEC as well, the commuter train service as part of that project. So in those early harvest projects, CPEC has been very successful as far as timely implementation and completion of projects goes within costs, dynamics, etc. Where CPEC has sort of faltered over the last few years primarily is around what comes after these early harvest projects. So there were talks within master plans about phase two projects, particularly around manufacturing as well as agriculture. Those projects have not materialized in the way that they were envisioned. Now, I want to be very careful here in terms of saying that some of those projects have taken shape. So, for example, many people in your audience would be surprised to know that a Chinese brewery currently operates in Balochistan and makes beer in Pakistan. That was part of this investment project in CPEC, for example.
That's an interesting location. I would have thought Murray historically has been where the breweries have been in Pakistan, but Balochistan for that particular project, how successful is it?
It's been quite successful. It's called Hui Brewery, and I mean the Chinese have taken different people on tours of that brewery as well. And from what I've gathered, it's a pretty professional and pretty state of the art operation over there. You similarly have Chinese investments in places like Faisalabad for textiles and mobile phone assembly. These were all supposed to be sort of phase two projects. So the point here is that more was expected and some stuff has happened but not a whole lot. But then you've had other investments from the Chinese as well. For example, Pakistan Stock Exchange, I think if I remember correctly, 40% of that was bought by Chinese entities. And Financial bought out Telenor Microfinance Bank in Pakistan. So that private B2B's type of activity has happened, but the CPEC phase two envisioned it to be at a much grander scale. So that's where things have faltered a bit. But the one area where I think the most sort of tension has emerged, at least on the economic side, we can go into the security side later if you'd like to focus on that. But on the economic side, the one area where investor sentiment has soured on Pakistan, particularly on the Chinese side, has been around the power sector. And their unpaid dues to the Chinese, last count, roughly $2 to $2.5 billion is the estimated number, although it's hard to put together. These payments are due to Chinese investors from their independent power producer contracts. And those payments have sort of been halted in the post pandemic environment. And because of Pakistan's power sector crisis that is ongoing right now. And so that has left a bad taste in the mouth of Chinese investors, including the Chinese government, in terms of saying that, hey, you had sovereign agreements here, and therefore you owe these people the returns that were promised. The Pakistani argument is that we do and we will pay, but also we have an ongoing economic crisis, and therefore we would like to see some of these agreements be renegotiated. To which so far the Chinese answer has been no, that we're not going to renew or review any contracts in that space. So I think that's where sort of the phase two of the project has had some headwinds that it has faced. And so far, a lot of people talk about in Pakistan about a new phase of CPEC, the rollout of the ML1 railway line, for example, as being one of the bigger projects that comes in this new phase. And so far, the Chinese have been less enthusiastic about pushing forward with these projects, to the extent that over the past sort of post-pandemic environment, Sinosure, which is the main insurance body on the Chinese side that gives insurance to almost all of these projects, has not given the insurance umbrella coverage as a result of this tension that exists in the next phase of CPAC.
Right. And, touching upon the subject of the economic crisis, the poly crisis, whatever you might call it in Pakistan, I want to draw upon your experience as an economist to maybe talk about one of the bigger critiques of many Belt and Road Initiative projects, of which CPEC is maybe the centerpiece. And that's the so called debt trap diplomacy argument. And a lot of critics say that China basically invests in these projects that places an excessive debt burden on developing countries like Pakistan, which China subsequently leverages to gain concessions, as we've maybe seen in the case of Hanbantota Port in Sri Lanka. I have two questions. Firstly, given Pakistan is still emerging from the macroeconomic crisis and near default state it was facing last year, to what extent do you hold CPEC and those investments responsible for that situation? And to follow up on that, as an economist, where do you fall on the spectrum of the debt trap debate? Do you think that CPEC is an example of that approach? Or do you think those investments are necessary for Pakistan's overall development?
Well, first of Tushar, thanks for the promotion and calling me an economist. I don't have a PhD in economics, so a lot of my economist friends would be like, don't call yourself an economist, but I will take the promotion from you any day of the week. Look, first of all, let's start with this debt trap question, right? Because it's a very important one, and one where I sort of disagree with the Washington norm of describing these as debt traps. And the reason for that is primarily because, look, when you say there's debt trap diplomacy by the Chinese, it kind of takes agency away from the other side in terms of being a sovereign and making decisions about what they consider to be good for their own people and for their own economy. And this is a very important context that people should keep in mind with regards to the types of projects Pakistani signed up for at what point in time. As I said, primarily these were power projects and road infrastructure projects, but the main thrust was power because Pakistani people from Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad, and to small towns and villages were suffering a whole lot from power outages that lasted 16 to 18 hours a day. Um, and so at that point in time, they needed financing to solve this problem that was a political problem. So if you follow the 2013 general election campaign and look at the speeches given by the main politicians, especially the Sharif brothers who went on to win the election, this was their number one promise that if you bring us to power, we know how to develop big infrastructure and we will solve this power sector crisis. And so the Chinese provided financing for that, as did to an extent the United States provided a bunch of support. So, for example, some of the main Chinese infrastructure projects in the hydro side, the main engines, turbines for those power plants were provided by GE in support with support of the United States. For example, the United States also provided significant regulatory support to Pakistan to develop an LNG policy, which then led to the emergence of a pretty robust liquefied natural gas sector in Pakistan, in which the United States' companies, including Accelerate, for example, participate into this day as well. So the Pakistanis made these choices, and it wasn't as if the Chinese were selling them something that the Pakistanis did not know what they were getting. In fact, if at that point in time, many, including myself, were asking this question of the Pakistanis in terms of saying, "Look, you're borrowing a whole lot of money to solve a crisis that really does exist, and people are feeling the pinch of that. but how are you going to balance the books here? And that was the number one question people would ask, and it would be dismissed. And there was this issue that the government would say that, look, we will export because there we will have surplus power and industry will be set up and the Chinese will set up industry, etc. Well, that did not happen in the way that, the rosy estimates of the government, including some ridiculous figures about what percentage of global trade will flow through Gwadar. Those promises did not materialize, and we can go into why that happened. But primarily on the power sector, if you were to focus on that as Exhibit A, the issue was that the Pakistanis were supposed to roll out power sector reforms to make that sector much more economically viable, to reduce overall costs or the burden on paying consumers in the power sector, particularly industrial units, and as a result, benefit from the power that was now available in the system. Well, that did not happen. And so when you did not do the reforms that were on your side, obviously you're going to be stuck with a bill that you cannot afford to pay at that point in time. That's number one. Number two, the Pakistanis also followed a flawed strategy of overvaluing their currency during this period of time. Now, if your goal is that we will have these dollar denominated contracts funded by the Chinese or anyone else for that matter, and we will pay these back by exporting our way out of this problem, having an overvalued exchange rate does not really make sense. But that was the strategy under then Finance Minister Ishaq Dar's tenure, which then led to a massive correction of the currency in 2017 onwards. And so you were eroding export competitiveness by default. Through the pursuit of this overvalued exchange rate. So that was the second problem, which then also created the third problem you alluded to in your question about the current account deficit and sort of debt sustainability, which is that you were importing a whole lot more. And as a result, your current account deficit was through the roof. And since you were maintaining an overvalued currency, you were deploying borrowed dollars essentially to maintain that value of the currency. And as a result, ultimately in 2017, 2018, you ended up with a major external sector crisis, which reverberates to this day, for example, in Pakistan. And so I think on that note, it was less about the total sum of borrowing that was done by the Chinese, although, yes, that was a key problem. So, for example, if you look at overall external sector debt owed to China and Chinese owned banks, etc., it went from roughly under 5% to close to 25, 27% by 2020, 2021. And it has stayed there since then because additional borrowing has sort of stagnated at that point in time due to the crisis. So I think the onus of dealing with this project and deploying that capital in a much more sustainable way was on the Pakistani side. And I think because Pakistan has had this perpetual issue, not just recent, but for decades, of failing to reform what is essentially a rent seeking economy that relies on external sector flows to sustain itself, because they did not change the nature of that economy, ultimately they ran into a current account deficit crisis that caused an external sector crisis, which became over the last couple of years a real sort of threat of imminent default on the Pakistani side, which it took a lot to walk back from that cliff.
Right. And I suppose one has to also account for, which I think you did, the fact that we face some unprecedented global crises back to back over the past few years. I don't know if anyone could have foreseen once in a century pandemic, as well as the twin conflicts in the Middle East and Russia, which spiked up oil prices, which I'm sure increased the import bill for Pakistan.
And if I may interrupt, right, that's a very important point. And if again we look at sort of, I did this USIP report at that point in time on sort of comparing the impact of the pandemic on Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And Pakistan, in the immediate era of the pandemic, actually did fairly reasonably well. compared to the peer economies, especially compared to sort of like a place like India that suffered a whole lot because of the lockdown it had in effect, right? And we all remember the visuals from that time coming out of India. They were horrific. Pakistan did a lot better. The pandemic did not spread in the way it did in India, for example. Pakistani exports grew, remittances were up. Pakistan also had access to a bunch of immediate emergency funding provided by the rest of the world, including the IMF. And the mistake the policymakers at that point did was they loosened a whole lot than they should have. And so once things began to normalize, that's really when the hangover kicked in for Pakistan. And then, as you alluded to, the war in Ukraine and the spike in oil prices, I think that was sort of the point where Pakistani politics also took a tailspin. And so Prime Minister Imran Khan, on his way out of power, froze energy prices right as they were spiking all over the world. And that, of course, led to a ballooning fiscal deficit and a painful, bout of inflation that had to be unleashed once those prices were allowed to be close to where the market was, by which point in time Pakistan was in a full-blown macroeconomic crisis.
Right. And well, it's been a few years since the pandemic. We've seen some recovery in the global economy, but there seems to be a deterioration in the security situation in Pakistan, let's say. We seem to be witnessing a rise in militancy and instability in Pakistan over the past few years, particularly in KP and Balochistan. Although it must be said that the Baloch situation seems to be simmering for quite a few years. It's not a sudden thing that's happened. But last October, we saw, two Chinese nationals who were killed in a suicide attack in Karachi. And we're witnessing a lot of direct attacks on CPEC projects by many militant groups. How is this growing militancy impacting CPEC's current and planned projects? Do you see it as a long-term threat, or just a temporary blip that you think is going to be resolved sooner or later? I'm talking about the militancy, of course. And do you see the stakeholders, both on the Chinese side and the Pakistani side, reevaluate certain aspects of CPEC specifically or indirectly as a result of the increased militancy?
Well, look, first up, terrorism is the biggest threat to the Pakistani economy and especially to the future of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And so far, while there has been a record spike in terror activity year on year, significant growth since the fall of Kabul. The fall of Kabul, which for at that point in time, Pakistani leaders, including then Prime Minister Imran Khan, referred to as Afghanistan breaking the shackles of slavery. The current defense minister in Pakistan at that time tweeting about the fall of Kabul in a quite positive way. The ISI chief of Pakistan going to Kabul and having that famous cup of tea at the Hotel Serena, in a way celebrating the return of the Taliban. That whole bet has sort of blown up in the face of Islamabad and Rawalpindi. So that is a huge challenge for the Pakistani state at this point in time. Just yesterday or day before yesterday, we're recording this on the 23rd. About 17 Pakistani soldiers were killed in a terror attack in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province as well. So casualties are skyrocketing there. But the reason why this has stayed out of the mainstream in Pakistani discourse is in part because of the fact that these attacks have been primarily limited west of the Indus. So they haven't come into the Pakistani cities and into the Pakistani heartland the way they had in 2013-14 era, or the sort of like 2007 to 2013-14 era, at which point in time Pakistan launched a major counterinsurgency campaign. So the first era, or the first thrust of this growing militancy terrorism problem, is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which then the second one is in Balochistan, where Baloch insurgent groups have been fighting an insurgency that goes as far back as the Musharraf era, in 2005-6 sort of era, when he used Pakistani military assets to kill Nawab Bukti, the former chief minister of Balochistan, and kickstarted a new insurgency. So this insurgency goes way back. And what has happened with the Baloch insurgency and Baloch militancy writ large is that the center of gravity has shifted from a decades old place which was rooted in the tribal system of Balochistan into the southern, less tribal, more urban, more lower middle class population centers of Balochistan. So the nature of that insurgency has also evolved, as has their capacity. And now we're beginning to see some evidence that both Baloch insurgent groups as well as the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, which are backed by and have sanctuaries in Afghan Taliban held Afghanistan, are collaborating and coordinating in certain places as well. But this is the biggest threat to and the biggest bone of contention between the Chinese and the Pakistanis at this point in time. The growing insecurity in Pakistan and the attacks that have happened on Chinese nationals. You mentioned the suicide bombing by a woman in Karachi. There have been more attacks. The Chinese ambassador on a visit to Quetta almost, was targeted in a bombing as well. He survived and he wasn't there at that point in time. But that threat is real, and it has become a pressing challenge in the relationship. And recently, there has been sort of Chinese efforts to make Pakistanis understand why that's the case. So through teams that have gone to China, including journalists, they've been told that, look, like in our country, we have a one-child policy. So when a Chinese national dies in a place like Pakistan that is seen as a very friendly country to China, it leads to a societal pushback and as a result a political pushback because people just have that one son who they lost, and an entire community mourns as a result of that. So the Chinese are quite serious about getting Pakistan to take action and to improve the overall security dynamic. Part of that, to your point on how is that leading to a change in the relationship, part of this is causing a conversation where the Chinese are pushing Pakistanis to allow their own security companies to operate on Pakistani soil. So this is almost like war on terror with a new twist, or with the Chinese packaging now, right? The Americans wanted Pakistan to allow their own security services, the famed Blackwaters, etc., of that time to provide security to American nationals and American interests in Pakistan. And Pakistanis always said no. Now the Chinese are making a similar demand, whether through a joint venture or through special permits, etc. And the Pakistanis so far are resisting. But every attack on Chinese nationals or Chinese projects leads to, lesser ability on the Pakistani side to push back on this demand that the Chinese have. So I would say in sum, insecurity in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is a major issue in the relationship now. The Chinese are publicly speaking about this as well. And writ large, again, this is not just a China issue. In a country that requires foreign investment, that requires, foreign talent coming in and helping expand the capacity of its own economy, having any sort of terrorism is going to be a deterrent for all sorts of investors. And if the Chinese, who have a higher, I would say, relatively higher risk tolerance than, let's say, European and American executives coming into a country, are having problems, then I think it's a bad omen for the broader economic environment in Pakistan.
Right. And that's a very interesting point you made about the impact on China and Chinese families when, perhaps the only child supporting two parents and four grandparents, is killed in an attack in a friendly country. I should mention we just passed the 10-year anniversary of the horrific attack on the Army Public School in Peshawar in 2014, which did lead to a substantial crackdown and militancy and on Pakistan's side. Lastly, I wonder what is your assessment of the economic viability of CPEC in the long run? You mentioned that some ministers had made outsized claims as to the percentage of global trade that would pass through CPEC. But do you think that if Pakistan got some things right, let's say it managed certain structural reforms, it got the security situation under control, Do you think that the CPEC could still have the potential of being sort of China's Marshall Fund for Pakistan, a driver of growth and regional trade? Or do you see it mainly as a project for China's geostrategic interests? And what's your outlook for the future of CPEC, given its importance to China's overall Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, let's start with the geopolitics of this, right? I frequently in these conversations, we're on audio. Otherwise, I would have pulled out a map and explained this a lot better for the audience listening. Maybe open up a global map and follow along here. If the United States and the West is pursuing, let's say, projects like AUKUS to outflank or hem in the Chinese on the eastern side of the world, let's say through the Pacific side, right? With submarine pacts, defense relationships, etc., with places like the Philippines. So the Chinese are outflanked in the east there, let's say, on the map. Then there's only one way for the Chinese to, move on the map in a way that allows them some level of capacity to outflank the West as a rival in a way that guards Chinese economic and energy interests. And that place is the Arabian Sea and or the Persian Gulf. And there are two countries that are largely speaking, closer to China than the West in that space. One is Iran, the other is Pakistan. And in both those places, the Chinese have significant investments on ports, Gwadar and Chabahar being the two that I'm referring to here. And so, totally, there is a realistic and a non-zero probability that a place like Gwadar eventually can be used by China as a strategic outpost for its naval presence around where CENTCOM operates as a means to guard its interests as well as outflank sort of what is emerging in the Eastern theater, so to speak. So I think that's a very important thing for people to pay attention to. And I don't think anyone who says, oh, no, this will never happen, is sort of seriously looking at the map. Forget about the politics of this all. On the politics of this, it's also important to see that the Pakistanis also realize that this is a scenario in which they can be drawn into, and therefore they need to overtly show that they're trying to balance. So, for example, a few months ago, the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, Ambassador Bloom, was in Gwadar, and he delivered a speech in Gwadar. Those things don't just happen by chance. These are orchestrated trips that the Pakistanis gave him a permission to go there, check it out, give a speech there. And primarily the signal here was that we're trying to balance. Don't consider us always in the Chinese camp. We can and want to be a swing state. At least that's how I read the signal of allowing Ambassador Bloom into Gwadar for that speech and for that visit. So that's the geopolitics of this. In terms of can CPEC, help Pakistan in a meaningful and sustainable way, I think the answer to that is yes. If you look at any country that is trying to develop and that is trying to industrialize and become part of the global economy, it requires three core things to begin with, right? It needs some level of ability to play labor arbitrage, meaning cheap labor that can do base assembly at the beginning and export basic value added goods and then climb up that technical ladder over time, which is what South Korea, China, Vietnam, etc. have done over the years. And the playbook for that is quite simple. To use that labor and talent, you need good infrastructure, particularly road and port connectivity to export your way out to the rest of the world. And you need abundant power and cheap power to solve and to provide the energy for that industrialization to occur. Now, through CPEC, as we discussed, Pakistan has developed very good road highway infrastructure, and it has significant amounts of excess energy in the system right now. Now, the challenge on the energy side is Pakistan needs power sector reforms. And that's a political problem that the Pakistani elite are running into how do we reform the power sector in a way that allows us to leverage this excess capacity to industrialize in ways that was originally envisioned through CPEC. That is for the Pakistani elite and the Pakistani policymaking community to decide. I think the problem that they will run into is the politics of the power sector and then the politics of the way in which Pakistan's domestic economy works. And this is where I think it's important to point out the fact that Pakistan follows and for decades has followed a heartland strategy, meaning everything flows into the Punjab for value addition to happen. And then that's the economic center. Well, the economic center in the Punjab makes sense from an export capacity point of view if you can trade with India, or if through Afghanistan, Central Asia is a big market, or Iran is open for business. But those are not places that are open for business for Pakistan at this point in time, which leaves the seas as the main access point for Pakistani exports. And if the seas are your main access point for exports, then you have to have a strategy that makes places like Karachi significantly more competitive than what they are. And the bulk of investment and economic activity and export economic activity has to happen along your coastline. And this is where the politics of the whole situation come in, because Pakistan politically is dominated by the Punjab, which means that every major investment policy push that will be made will focus on this heartland strategy, not on the coastal strategy. And so long as that remains the case, Pakistan's ability to maximize the output and to maximize the potential of the base infrastructure that CPEC has provided will always be limited. And I think some people in Pakistan are beginning to talk about it. The fact that Pakistan needs a more coastal oriented strategy to take advantage of the export opportunities the seas provide. And I think if they do that, then CPEC becomes a lot more viable. The final point I will make on this is that whether it's CPAC or something else, the viability of the Pakistani economy requires wholesale economic reforms that transition the country away from this rent-seeking model, both domestically and geopolitical rents, into realizing that there is an opportunity with shifting supply chains, with the reorientation of global trade that is happening and is likely to accelerate under a Trump 2.0 administration. They can take advantage of that, but it requires a rethink of how the country operates. It requires a real focus on improving the security situation, and it requires sustainable, common sense economic policies that don't, for example, burn foreign reserves, borrowed foreign reserves for maintaining an overvalued currency, for example, or freeze energy prices because the politics has shifted in Islamabad. So I think, again, to conclude, the onus on this is on the Pakistani policymaker. I think whether it's China or the United States or some other source of capital, if Pakistan reforms its economy, capital will flow in a sustainable way. And if the Pakistanis get their act together in terms of having a more coastal strategy, then I think they can take advantage of some of the broader global winds that are reshaping supply chains and international trade.
Right. So potentially this CPEC could be a dynamo for Pakistan's growth, but it is contingent on political reforms as well as developing a stronger export-led economy, which itself is contingent on a favorable export environment. We might see some changes with Trump 2.0, as you mentioned. So yeah, thank you so much for your insights, Uzair. Where can our listeners find you?
They can find me at Uzair Younus on X. I'm trying out Blue Sky these days as well, so more active there than most. And yeah, check out the podcast Pakistonomy. I had to do that shameless self-promotion plug as well.
Fantastic. So thanks again for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
So that was Uzair Younus, who gave us a pretty detailed overview of the economic side of CPEC. But the question of the viability of CPEC doesn't just depend on the economic fundamentals of the projects, but also the security situation that it operates under. And the ongoing instability in Pakistan's frontier regions is a matter of concern, not just for CPEC, but for Pakistan as a whole. To help us break down the security aspect of this issue, we're happy to welcome back Kunwar Khuldune Shahid. Kunwar is a Pakistan-based correspondent for The Diplomat, who's also an editor at 101 Reporters, a pan-Asian network of grassroots reporters. His work has been featured in The Guardian, The Independent, Foreign Policy, BBC, and a number of other prestigious outlets. We had Kunwar back on last January to discuss the Pakistan election, And Kunwar has written extensively about this issue, including an article on how the CPEC is being directly targeted on the diplomat. So we're very happy to have him back on. So Kunwar, great to speak to you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Tushar.
So Kunwar, we're seeing that Pakistan is just emerging out of the poly crisis that it found itself in a few years ago. Yet the security situation doesn't seem to be improving. In fact, we're seeing an uptick in militancy. Could you outline some of the militancy and security issues that Pakistan has faced since 2021, with particular focus on its frontier provinces? That's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan.
Definitely, in many ways, Pakistan is coming out of many of its crises. The economy is improving, the inflation is going down, and even if you look at the security itself, Pakistan hosted the SEO summit. You had the Indian Minister of External Affairs, Mr. Jaishankar, who visited Islamabad after a gap of almost a decade. So, in many ways, you could argue the security is improving. Pakistan is about to host the Champions Trophy, a major global event, for the first time since 1996. So if you look at those realities, you could argue the security is improving. But then you look at the western frontier, you look at the KP and Balochistan. So it's almost like Pakistan's living a bifurcated reality. You know, especially since 2021, the attacks in KP and Balochistan have risen in many ways. They've multiplied. Since 2020, for instance, in 2022, according to reports, Pakistan had 380 attacks. In 2023, Pakistan had around 650, militant attacks. And in 2024 till December, I think around 900 attacks already. So as you can see, the numbers are increasing. And over 95% of these attacks are taking place in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So when I say it's a bifurcated reality, that's what it is. Living in Punjab or even Sindh as compared to living in Balochistan and KP, completely different Pakistan right now. And Pakistan right now is facing two major security threats in terms of ideology. One of them, obviously, is the jihadist threat, which Pakistan has faced, for decades. And that jihadist threat is led by the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the Pakistani Taliban, and its many affiliated factions. And then you have the nationalist separatist militancy, led by Baloch separatism. And among the Baloch, you have the BLA, the Baloch Liberation Army, that's leading that militancy. And in recent months, we saw in Quetta, the capital of Balochistan, you had the railway station bombing, but over 30 people were killed. Then in October, and this is critical because I'm sure this will be a critical part of our discussion. In October, we saw an attack by the BLA at the Karachi airport, where Chinese nationals were targeted and killed, and that has been a growing trend in recent years, especially this year. In March alone, Pakistan saw BLA target the Gwadar port in an attack, naval base in Balochistan, and then 5 Chinese engineers were killed in Bisham in another military attack. So these are coordinated attacks explicitly targeting China, Chinese investment, or anything that can be considered has a connection with Chinese presence in Pakistan. But then at the same time, slightly unrelated to all of this, you have sectarian clashes going on in Kurram, which is part of the former FATA, former federally administered tribal areas, now called the merged districts since 2018. So you have those clashes going on, and all of this is going on in the Western Front. So the security situation over there is arguably, and if you look at the stats, if you look at the number of attacks that have been going on for the past decade, it's worse than it has been for the past decade.
Right. And it's interesting because I think some of this violence or upsurge in violence one could point to could be drawn from, let's say, the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, which is ostensibly a Pakistani ally. But we're seeing the relationship deteriorate for quite a while now. In fact, we just had news about cross-border airstrikes by the Pakistan Air Force on TTP strongholds, that's Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, in Afghanistan, highlighting the rise of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and the steady deterioration of Pakistan-Afghan relations since 2021. Could you talk about the TTP and its evolution since 2021? How is it contributing to militancy and instability in the frontier areas? To what extent is the Kabul regime supporting it? And since you mentioned the sectarian clashes, could you also talk about the security situation in KPK overall?
When we refer to 2021, obviously we refer to the Afghan Taliban's takeover of Kabul. And it's critical. I mean, looking at what has happened since 2021 is important, but with regards to the TTP, it's also important to note what happened in the lead up to 2021. In 2018, Noor Wali Mahsood replaced Fazlullah in 2018. And since then, because for a couple of years, especially post Operation Zarb-e-Azb, there was a tangible decrease in the militant activity orchestrated by TTP, at least the TTP main group. But since Noor Wali Mahsood took over in 2018, what we've seen is that gradually TTP began increasing its attacks, initially across Pakistan, but then gradually limiting itself to the Western Front. And what we've also seen in the lead up to 2021, it was almost like a countdown of former jihadist affiliates of the TTP coming together and merging with the TTP main group. We saw Lashkar-e-Jhanvi, for instance, Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, all these factions that had splintered out of TTP, especially post Zarb-e-Azb. They came together, and once it was formalized, the Taliban's takeover of Kabul was formalized, TTP in itself came together with all its factions. Now, what happened after that, there was obviously the question was going to be what next for TTP, because once the Afghan Taliban took charge of Kabul, there was practically celebration, not just among the obviously Taliban ranks, but also in Islamabad as well. Back then, the then Prime Minister Imran Khan famously said that the shackles of slavery have been broken. So Pakistani state was celebrating. If all the Taliban factions, if everybody's celebrating, then why would there be cause of conflict? And the conflict actually emerged from the fact that, like you said, that the Afghan Taliban were supposed to be the allies of the Pakistani state, but that is not how it transpired. It was almost as if, without putting it out in words or without officially labeling it as such, the Afghan Taliban were using the Pakistani state support to gradually propel themselves to power. And once they're in power, they no longer felt any obligation towards, completely backing Pakistan's policy in the region. So in many ways, they thought that now we are an independent entity. We are in charge of Afghanistan. So we get to decide what's in our best interest. Among those things that they felt, that the Afghan Taliban felt was in their best interest, was to strengthen the Pakistani Taliban, or the TTP. So a lot of the TTP leaders were released from prison. And in many ways, the Pakistani state initially welcomed that as well. The regime at the time, both the civil and military leadership at the time, they thought that they could offer, and it was offered as well. Amnesty was offered to the Taliban militants. They were asked to join the mainstream. And for a while, the Afghan Taliban brokered negotiations and a peace treaty between the Pakistani Taliban and the Pakistani state as well. But that treaty was intermittently broken, with both parties, the TTP and the Pakistan army, accusing each other of breaking the terms of the treaty. And at the same time, what we saw in 2023 was the creation of this mysterious jihadist group that was called Tehreek-e-Jihad. Almost, I don't know, lazily conjured up name. Its origins remain mysterious, but it carried out two of the most prominent attacks in 2023. One was at Mianwali Air Base, one of the most prominent air bases in Pakistan, and the D.I. Khan police station. Now, both these attacks were carried out while at the same time there was talks going on, although, of course, you had the official ceasefire in 2022, but there was still a discussion going on with regards to mainstreaming the Pakistani Taliban, with regards to potentially having fruitful ties with the Afghan Taliban. And the Afghan Taliban, at the same time, again without officially acknowledging it, have been backing the TTP especially through the Haqqani network, which is aligned in their ideology, they're aligned in their interests. And in terms of their geographical location, the Haqqani network and TTP, of course, they are situated along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and of course in the Afghanistan province of Pakhtunkhwa and Khost, which have been targeted recently by the Pakistan Air Force as well. So that's the geographical location, and that's where basically Pakistan alleges that these TTP camps are situated, and which is what the Pakistani state claims was their target of the recent operation.
Right. And I suppose the question there is that why is there, even though there are ongoing talks between Taliban regime in Afghanistan and the Pakistani state, I guess the question is why is there a divergence in terms of, or is there a divergence in terms of the TTP and affiliated groups carrying out attacks in Pakistan. Yesterday, I was watching, I think, Najam Sethi talk about this, and his contention was that there seems to be some split within factions of the Haqqani network and the Kandahar leadership of the Taliban. And in reality, the Afghan government wants to, become a normal country, wants to exploit the geopolitical situation, connect Central Asia, but the different factions and their splits are causing this mixed policy. To what extent do you agree with that assessment?
Definitely. I mean, the factions are absolutely divided. But if you look at the regime that's running Afghanistan right now, if you look at the language that they're using with regards to Pakistan and globally as well, they are trying, as they've been doing so since 2021, they are presenting themselves as statesmen. Their language is no longer that of a jihadist group. The way they are communicating with Beijing, the way they are, reaching out to the Western country, the way they're, partaking in back channel negotiations via Qatar and all these countries. What they want is legitimacy. So what they're trying to convey is that they are in charge. And the way to do that is to suggest that, whichever factions exist, obviously you can't help but have factions, but you need to present yourself as a guarantor of security in the country that you're claiming to rule. So that is what the Afghan Taliban are trying to present. And that is simultaneously, if you look at the TTP strategy in Pakistan as well, why was the Tehreek-e-Jihad, for instance, was there a need to create Tehreek-e-Jihad? When they officially allied with TTP, TTP could just have claimed those attacks as its own. It did not do that because it wanted to come across as someone, as a group that is willing to negotiate, that is willing to be on the negotiation table, while at the same time creating a power show that suggests that, yes, we have certain affiliated groups that are willing to carry out certain security strategies, which ironically is exactly what the Taliban was for the Pakistani state for the past couple of decades till 2021. So these groups, they're trying to do, as far as I can see, is take claim as the sole authority that can guarantee peace in any particular. The Afghan Taliban are trying to do that in Afghanistan, while the Pakistani Taliban are trying to do that in on the Western Front, especially in the former Fatah areas. But they would like to expand that influence across KP and even Balochistan.
Right. And now, coming to Balochistan, because, the Baloch insurgency has been a long running issue for Pakistan for a very long time, far preceding even the past 10, 20 years. And the sheer importance of Gwadar to CPEC makes it a critical issue for the success of CPEC. Could you explain the Baloch insurgency overall, its origins, its evolution, and maybe then talk about the more recent impact on CPEC projects and why that's happening?
Yeah, of course. I mean, talking about the history itself of the Baloch insurgency, we could spend hours on that. But very briefly, the Baloch question is as long as the existence of Pakistan. The Pakistan inherited what is now the consolidated, what you call the Balochistan province. It was basically inherited from the British Empire, and at the time in 1947, when the subcontinent was partitioned to India and Pakistan, of course, it was basically constituted of princely states and tribal areas. Those princely states were obviously the most prominent among them was the state, princely state Kala. So, for all practical purposes, Balochistan was annexed militarily in 1948, but they obviously did not accept the legitimacy of the Pakistani rule over the realm. So there were insurgencies in 50s and 60s, but of course, the most prominent military operation in Balochistan was carried out in the early 1970s. And that was basically in the aftermath of 1971, when Pakistan obviously lost its eastern wing, the then East Pakistan, which of course has since become Bangladesh. That insurgency in the 70s was quelled under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto via a military operation. Again, that created more resentment. The recent wave of Baloch separatist militancy, like you said, is at least a couple of decades old. It is rooted in the announcement of the Gwadar port, the construction work that began in 2003, because at the time the local population felt that the benefits of whatever economic activity is transpiring over here might not be shared with them. In 2006, you saw the operation against the tribal chief Akbar Bukti, and after that, of course, the BLA, of course, became more active, and not just that, the military operations in Pakistan became more robust as well. And since then, there have been massive reports of human rights abuses. There are claims of tens of thousands of, at least thousands of missing persons, definitely, while the groups like Voice of Baloch Missing Persons claim there are over 50,000 missing Baloch people since over the past couple of decades as well. The bottom line is that Balochistan itself is a resource-rich province. Then a prominent example of exploitation of Balochistan's resources is Sui gas. The Sui town of Sui, where massive reservoir of gas was discovered in 1952, has been supplying gas to the entirety of Pakistan since since the 50s. Whereas there are still at least a couple of dozens of districts in Balochistan that don't have natural gas supply. So those the idea that their resources are being exploited, are being appropriated. These created over the past couple of decades. These created groups like the Baloch Republican Army and the United Baloch Army. The two of them merged into the Baloch Nationalist Army, and you had the Balochistan Liberation Front as well. So many militant groups, but at the end of the day, the group that has maintained itself as at the forefront of Baloch separatist militancy is the one we've already discussed, BLA, Baloch Liberation Army. They are the ones that are most active. And in addition to the recent attacks that on the Chinese engineers, the attacks that we recently cited, the BLA has attacked Chinese consulate in Karachi in 2018. They also targeted the Pearl Continental Hotel in Gawad. It's a luxury hotel. They targeted in 2019, and that's not only is it a hotel where a lot of Chinese professionals and Chinese nationals they stay over there. For the BLA, and if you read their statements, for them it's also emblematic of the Pakistani state and the Chinese state and their collaboration, their neoliberal venture in Balochistan and the appropriation of Balochistan resources. So which is also another reason they targeted, for instance, the Pakistan Stock Exchange in Karachi in 2020. The attack itself was foiled. The BLA's attack was foiled, but the plan was to attack the stock exchange, hold people over there hostage. And again, the stock exchange being a symbol of economy, of fiscal progress. So that is also a statement they wanted to make. So it's very clear the BLA's ideology is very clear that they're the resources and they don't want it to be appropriated. But the recent most colonizer that that the groups like especially BLA, they see China as the current colonizer. So a lot of these attacks are taking place not just against Chinese engineers or big installations, even Chinese teachers, for instance, targeted in an attack in 2022 in at the Karachi University. So these are these are basically the challenges that CPEC faces. Well, at the same time, we talk about security challenge, but there are rights movements in Balochistan that some would argue are becoming more pronounced than they have been, at least in a few decades. You have the Balochistan Yakjahati Committee, which is led by Marang Baloch. She's getting prominence as an activist for Baloch rights, for the Baloch missing persons, or Balochistan's rights to its own resources. And then you had for the past 4 years, you had the Haq Do Tehreek as well, which was led by Hidayatul Rahman, who's now a member of the Balochistan Assembly. So while there's militancy going on, there are other avenues of protest, other avenues of activism, other avenues for Balochistan and Baloch people expressing themselves as well. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there is an arbitrary crackdown these movements, and that many feel is counterproductive. If the idea is to launch a counterinsurgency, successful counterinsurgency operation, you need to back the security operation with political solutions.
Right, and we'll get to the sort of response to the situation. But I do want to ask one question about, we've heard reports of coordination between different groups, like the DTP and Baloch separatists, amongst others. And you've both outlined here and reported previously on how some of them are specifically targeting CPEC projects. I guess my question is, why are they choosing to target CPEC? What are they looking to gain from this? CPEC is a national priority for Pakistan, and it's also an international priority for China, and risking the wrath of the Pakistani and Chinese establishments. What exactly are they looking to gain from these attacks?
I think, like I said, in many ways, China now represents what the Baloch nationalists feel is the colonization, right? So that's the one in terms of an ideological reason. That's the reason. But in many ways, China, and of course, the question as to why are groups like TTP and BLA collaborating? They are not ideologically aligned in many ways, and in fact, if you look at their roots, they come from very diverging camps, even in the geopolitical narrative, so to speak. So why are they aligning? Both of them have found China as a common enemy. We've already discussed why, obviously, the Baloch considered China as a colonizing power, but even for the Taliban and the jihadists in general, there is growing resentment against Beijing's policies against Uyghur Muslims and the internment camps. There is a growing discontent. Obviously, it is not as profound or not as publicly visible as you would see something like an anti-US sentiment, for instance, or anti-US sentiment, because the state is being very careful. The Pakistani state is being very careful, in terms of not giving any signals to China that what might make them even more apprehensive about the future of their investments than they already are. For instance, there has been a brewing protest against the Chinese detaining, for instance, Uyghur wives of Pakistani nationals, and we have seen that in recent years. A lot of Pakistani men who got married to Uyghur women, when they would some of these women, when they traveled back to China, they weren't allowed to. Not only were they not allowed to come back to Pakistan, some of them, nobody's heard of many of them for a while as well. That has been a recent concern. Plus, a bigger issue right now is that the Pakistani state is actually helping China crack down on a lot of the Uyghur militants or individuals that China or feels is a part of Uyghur jihadism. And what makes it even more conducive to the Taliban's interest is that a lot of these, for those who are advocating militancy, they are aligning themselves with the Taliban as well. So ideologically, Taliban are selling um, the the safeguard of Uyghur Muslim rights as a cause, while at the same time, in terms of manpower, they are finding a lot of those people who are victims of Chinese policies who are joining their ranks. But what the Taliban are doing, especially both the Afghan Taliban and even the Pakistani Taliban, is that they are not making this narrative public. The Afghan Taliban are obviously very clear about the fact that they have been reaching out to Beijing. They want Chinese investment in Afghanistan. They want to collaborate with China. And in many ways, I genuinely believe that what I think they're trying to do is convey they are the group, or they are the organization, so to speak, that controls in many ways the security situation in certain parts of the western front of Pakistan. And hence, perhaps, the idea would be to follow the Afghan Taliban model, something you've seen in Syria as well with the Nusra Front or with the Boko Haram in Nigeria, is for a jihadist group, for instance, to take over a particular realm and say that we now control this and we are responsible for whatever transpires over here. Anyone who's interested in any investment, whether it's economical investment, whether it's any in terms of security investment, they can become the guarantors of that. So perhaps that is where the TTP and the BLA collaboration comes into the picture as well, that both view themselves going forward as a better guarantor of, Chinese infrastructure on the Western Front than Pakistan. As things stand, that, thought might seem a bit far-fetched, but the TTP's idea of a greater Taliban, for instance, let's not forget that neither the Afghan Taliban nor the Pakistani Taliban, they don't recognize the Durand Line. They don't recognize the Afpak border. And obviously no Afghan regime in the past has recognized that either. So that is obviously a goal as well, that if the Afghan Taliban are governing Afghanistan, perhaps the Pashtun territories in Pakistan should come under the control of the TTP. And TTP also redefines itself as a political entity.
Right, and that's interesting because they're essentially asking for a seat at the table. I suppose I want to ask about the response to this because how have the military and civilian governments responded to this uptick in militancy in both areas, in Balochistan and KPK? And why have they been unable to control it so far? It's now the 10-year anniversary recently of the APS Peshawar attack, after which the army launched the Zarb-e-Azb, which, did bring down terrorism and militancy substantially. Is the army looking to replicate this with its new operations like Azam-e-Istikam?
I think practically what these operations do is that they completely pulverize entire towns and areas, and you have mass migration out of those cities. So when they're touted as success stories, once you're destroying infrastructure and removing all semblance of human activity from those areas, of course there's going to be a decrease in militancy from those areas. But of course that's not the long term solution. The irony here is azme istikam in Urdu translates into resolve for stability. That is not what any military operation in the world can achieve. Any form of stability, you want to come up with political solutions as well. And the civilian leadership, for instance, the Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, when the Azmi Istehkam was announced, it was backed up by rhetoric. I would say that it's not just a military operation. What we're trying to do is we will address the economic grievances of Balochistan as well. You don't see that in terms of policy making. You don't even see that in terms of promises. For instance, if the Baloch activists right now, if they're demanding that the missing persons be given justice, the state's reaction, their argument is that either the missing persons are for instance dying in tribal clashes, or they are somehow all of them are affiliated with BLM militancy, hence all of them are enemies of the state. uh, what we are also hearing is that, especially in recent months, with the spike in anti-China militancy and attacks on Chinese, engineers and installations, that there was a discussion on the potential of a Chinese military base in Pakistan. And this has been discussed. There are multiple sources that have conveyed that, discussed not in the sense of it being a reality anytime soon, but the fact that this even was mentioned in an official table of discussion shows the gravity of the Chinese concerns. And it's not just what we are hearing from confidential sources. The official statement that came out from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in March, it was an uncharacteristically strongly worded statement asking Pakistan to do more to safeguard Chinese workers and Chinese lives and Chinese investment in Pakistan. And it was almost like this is not something that China normally does. It's in terms of these assertions, they usually take place behind closed doors. But it was almost quite you know America-esque in how it was asking Pakistan to do more. And that what that has done is that in while again the military base is just it's still a conversation, um, still in almost like an informal conversation. But what has already happened last month is that for the first time in 5 years, Pakistan and China had a joint military drill. And that obviously signifies that China has not been happy with the security situation with regards to CPEC, with regards to China's interests in, especially in the along the western route of CPEC. And um, it might, again, even if it's not in the shape of a military base per se, it might get more militarily involved. We might see more of these security drills and more collaboration between Chinese military intelligence and Pakistani military intelligence. And we've already seen that when it comes to Pakistan crackdown on, for instance, Uyghur militants and dissidents. So that is something that might increase in 2025 and in the coming years.
Right. And lastly, I want to ask you a somewhat sensitive geopolitical question, and that is the question of foreign interference. Now, we've heard many stakeholders, both in Pakistan as well as some abroad, who allege a foreign hand playing a role in some of this instability that specifically aims to destabilize CPEC and China's influence in the region. We've discussed substantially the domestic players and, their intentions and their aspirations. But with the exception of Afghanistan, which I think it's pretty clear that they're having some hand in this, to what extent are the allegations of foreign interference credible? How and why might certain foreign players look to undermine the CPAC?
I think with regards to Balochistan specifically, Balochistan has a history of uh, getting embroiled in various geopolitical dogfights or rivalries, whether it's sectarian rivalry or for instance, we discussed the major military operation 1973 that the Bhutto regime undertook. It came in the aftermath of significant amount of military supplies being found in the Iraqi assembly, Islamabad. At the time, of course, Iraq and Iran were at loggerheads, and one of the first things that Bhutto, the then prime minister, did before he launched the operation was he wrote to, I believe, it was President Nixon at the time. He wrote and said that India and Iraq and the Soviet Union, they are using the Baloch insurgents to destabilize the whole region. And of course, let's not forget this was before 1979. This was before the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So even before that, there was Pakistan wanted global powers to be interested, and even the military operation itself, orchestrated by the Bhutto regime, it had support from the Shah of Iran, who, himself and his regime was fighting the Baloch, separatists, Baloch separatism on the Iranian side. So there is that angle as well. And talking about Iran, in January 2024, Pakistan and Iran practically went to war. They both, we talk about, Pakistan targeting Afghanistan's territory. In January, Iran targeted Pakistani territory. Iran claimed that they are, targeting the hideouts of Jaish al-Adl. Jaish al-Adl is, a Baloch Sunni jihadist group that has been targeting Iranian security installations on the other side of the border. So Iran accused Pakistan of basically, or, said that Jaish al-Adl is using the Pakistani territory to orchestrate attacks in Iran. And then Pakistan reciprocated and launched attacks in Iran. Obviously, it became a diplomatic, flashpoint. There was a mini crisis, but it was resolved pretty quickly as well. But it shows the involvement of, for instance, Iran. In naturally Iran, because the historical region of Balochistan, similar to how Kurdistan is in the Middle East, encompasses multiple states. Definitely Pakistan and Iran, parts of Afghanistan as well. So any movement for a consolidated Balochistan, whatever autonomous shape or form it might take, would naturally involve Iran and Afghanistan as well. But in terms of specifically targeting CPAC, concerns have been labeled from Washington. The US has already called CPEC a death trap for Pakistan. And and this is, of course, it's a sentiment that has been echoed within the Pakistani government as well. For example, the Imran Khan regime wanted to renegotiate the terms of CPEC, and there was a feeling within the ranks at the time that perhaps the contracts are not as fair to Pakistan as they should be. And of course, all of this took place in discussions behind closed doors, but Beijing was not happy. So, obviously, those are how the foreign players are coming, being involved in the narrative surrounding CPEC. And of course, once you talk about foreign involvement, anywhere in Pakistan and in the region, you can't help but mention India, of course. India in recent years, of course, has, and this is not just obviously in the greater games involving the intelligence agencies, of course, it's natural, for instance, given the fact that the ISI has been so heavily invested in the Kashmir insurgency in India. So, of course, naturally, you would have Indian agencies invested in Balochistan as well. But in terms of operational involvement, of course, it's nowhere near as heavily connected as ISI and the jihadist group in Kashmir were. But we saw, for instance, in the case of Kulbhushan Yadav, the Indian Navy officer who was arrested in 2016. Pakistan claims that he's a raw operative. Certain media reports within India that confirm that as well. Whereas, obviously, New Delhi completely denies it. So it is inevitable that Balochistan is going to have immense geopolitical importance going forward, and I think it will grow regardless of what the security situation might be going forward. Balochistan will have much more interests from the global and regional power than it has had in the past.
Right. So obviously, the location of Balochistan is going to make it a site for considerable geopolitical intrigue, which will be interesting to see how this plays out in 2025, including to see how China, asserts itself in the wake of a Donald Trump presidency. But that was fascinating, Kunwar. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
And thank you, dear listeners. We're going to be back next month with another podcast. Until then, stay safe, take care, and bye.